Kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce the arts, represent. I got notes and now I have to read it. It's to represent the gallery at our favourite yearly event, the Meet the Fellows. It's also a pleasure to introduce our wonderful convener and chair, Nicholas McBride, Director of Arts Festival Dunedin, and he in turn will introduce the fellows. So thank you, Nicholas, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. We'll wait for some. Please come in. 2 seats here, 1 seat there. Religious silence, isn't it? Yes. Thank you, Linda. Welcome to everybody. It's lovely to see you all here. This forum is an opportunity for us to hear from the fellows about their journey as creative artists. Some of them have already done public performances or events, and there will be more during this year. So this afternoon is an opportunity to hear them talking about their creative process. It's not a show and tell. If any time during this afternoon you can't hear us, then we'll just move forward or something so that we speak into our microphones more clearly. But if you can't, just shout and we'll adjust things. So the University Fellowships have been in existence for well over 50 years, not all of them, and they're actually a huge testament to the University of Otago's commitment to the creative process. Charles Brash wrote in Landfall in 1959, he said, "Part of a university's proper business is to act as a nurse to the arts, or more exactly, to the imagination as it expresses itself in the arts and sciences. Imagination may flourish anywhere, but it should flourish as a matter of course in a university, for it is only through imaginative thinking that society grows materially and intellectually." That quote is actually on the Arts Fellows website, which goes on to say that the fellowships have a vital role to play. We rely on the fellows and their craft to generate experiences that will challenge, entertain, provoke, and reassure us and tell us who we are. So that's what the University of Otago's website says about the fellows. So I'd like to introduce the 2018 fellows in no particular order, but in the order that they're sitting, which, funnily enough, this has got nothing to do with anything, but I just wrote all their names down yesterday, and when we came in today I just said, sit wherever you like, and they're all sitting, bar one, in exactly the same place. So that's pretty spooky, don't you think? Bodes well for something.
It's good to
Mozart Fellow, Dylan Lardelli, on the end here. Rhianne Gallagher is the Burns Fellow. The Francis Hodgkins Fellow is Louisa Menzies. And these two were around the wrong way on the end. Raymond Huber is, one moment. Raymond Huber is the University of Otago College of Education Creative New Zealand Children's Writer in Residence.
Sorry, what was that, Nicholas?
We actually had a conversation about this at lunchtime, about how we could, everybody gets tired when that name is mentioned, when the title is given. We need to work on that. And the Caroline Plummer Fellowship in Community Dance is this year held by Matthew Smith. The Fellows. So I'd like to start this afternoon by asking each of the fellows to tell us a little bit about their career to date and their journey as an artist?
Starting with me?
You're on the end.
Okay.
So,
How far should I go back?
oh well, your creative journey. When did that start?
Well, it's quite difficult because I think as a child you're not really aware and you can't articulate some things that are happening. But I can remember back having a type of need to create sounds, and I used to invent instruments and I would make them in my parents' garage because we didn't have instruments at home. And then my sister Lynn started to learn to play the guitar. She is a number of years older than me, so that became the instrument of the house. I since went on to study guitar and a number of instruments towards the end of high school, and then I enrolled into university in Wellington, did a degree in composition as well as guitar performance. So I hadn't really considered writing music before then, and then there was a whole world that opened up when I met the teachers, especially Jack Boddy, if people might have heard of, John Passathis, Ross Harris, these very important teachers. And especially Jack Boddy, he had an interest in our region in the world, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, North Asia as well. So sort of when I glance back at sort of growing up, these meetings of these people sort of made me realise that this was what I was actually leading up to and what I was sort of striving for. So I had an interest in sort of things I couldn't understand, languages that I didn't know. So through my music studies, I was also studying Japanese language, and through Jack Boddy, I was able to spend a lot of time in Japan, China, and Korea, and could see how all these cultures sort of influence each other. Sort of getting off the point, aren't I? So that gives a bit of a background. Up until now, since I did my degree, I've been fortunate enough to, when I finished university, was able to work with an orchestra full time, and then I went on to study in Germany, and that sort of opened my mind to so many possibilities, such a rich tradition that carried through for 1,000 years. That, so the respect they have for sonic arts in Europe is something I sort of a bit foreign to me to begin with, but that excitement of learning about the world has led me to want to bring all of those experiences back here and show people the possibility of music, and that music has no limitations, really.
It's a journey. It's a journey. Thank you. Rhianne, your career and your artistic journey to date, how come you're here?
If I start at the beginning, that's quite long.
Okay, well, just
So, I mean, I guess as a kid, I actually had quite a bit of difficulty with language at primary school, and I suppose my pleasure as a kid was more through the oral. That was kind of where I first engaged. So, sort of singing, and I was brought up a Roman Catholic, so the prayers were kind of recited in a very rhythmic way. And also as a kid, prayer made a real impression because it seemed the adults when they were praying, everything about them changed. And I thought, these prayer words are really powerful words. So, and I was held back a bit in primary school, but then I remember the day I learned to read, and I couldn't get these. I could get the word, I had the words, and then there were these things on the page, and I couldn't understand. I couldn't get this relationship at all. And then the day I learnt to read was, I still remember that day, and it was like being introduced to this magical thing, like words seemed to take on. Now I'd got initiated or something, I'd been let in, and because of the difficulty before, I think the words just, I never took them for granted either. And, so then I kind of caught up in primary school. I remember I suppose the other thing at primary school was the first time I wrote a poem, which we were told to write a poem, and I went to a country primary school, so the introduction to poetry was all the ballads that that the teacher, I think it was just an excuse for him to smoke his pipe, really. But we would have afternoons of him reading ballads, and then we were told we had to write a poem, so I didn't have much to go by except I knew you didn't use many words, and so the poem I tried to write is a poem I'm still trying to write, which was about dusk, and as I just loved that hour at dusk as a kid when you could hang out on the street and it wasn't time to go in, but the night was coming, and so I tried to write a poem about that, and there was a line in the poem about how the birds had stopped singing, and my teacher said to me at the time, I just remember being beside him at the desk and him saying something about the poem, and he said, oh yes, and the birds stopped singing, that could mean these other things. It could mean something was going to happen, like it could mean there was going to be an earthquake, and so that was my introduction to metaphor, I think, but I didn't know at the time, but I just thought, oh my goodness, I can say these things and they can say all these other things, and it always seemed to me that there were a lot of things that were not being said directly as among adults, and then I found in poetry it's possible to say one thing and it will mean potentially these other things. So that was another kind of secret thing about language. So so it was a long journey from there to being a poet. Like about...
Let's move on.
Yeah.
Louisa, your journey as an artist.
It's interesting listening to both of you speak about your childhood, because I don't think I trace my my formation as an artist that far back necessarily, and I would say it was really only at university age that the idea of being an artist even appeared to me or began to crystallize. I can glance back and see examples now of an interest in or a creative drive that I guess I had, but I didn't formally study art at school. But I remember some very vivid experiences with artworks. Actually, I happen to have been reflecting recently on my experience of a Ralph Hawthorne show at in the gallery. I think it was called the Annex, that used to be part of the art centre in Christchurch, that I would have seen probably at about age 15, that I've realised had a very strong impact on me. But I think in a way anything you see at that age has a strong impact. So but yeah, I really came to art, I think, through curiosity and through an interest in in the visual world, but also just in information and experience and how you might get to find an outlet for your subjectivity that could include a lot of different things. And maybe that's what I value about being an artist the most, is that I feel like the activities that art allows me to do include like interviews, include drawing, include filming, include travel, I feel like it's just this, I guess, actually it's not my idea. You hear people talk about art as a kind of world building exercise, and I feel like I just get to share how I build my world with others, and yeah, it's a great thing to get to do. Oh yes, sorry, I really should have said that. I meant to. Thank you for asking. I grew up in Canterbury. I was born in Lincoln. I spent a lot of time on Banks Peninsula and North Canterbury also in my childhood, and then I did my undergraduate degree in Wellington. The fine arts degree was just beginning at Massey University, and I was in their first intake of students, which was a great opportunity. There was a wonderful energy in that school at that time, and with a whole lot of new people starting a program. I spent some time in Wellington afterwards, and I was quite involved with an artist-run project space called Enjoy. And then I subsequently moved to Auckland, where I've been based for about 10 years now, until I have been here in Dunedin this year.
Thank you, Louisa. Raymond Huber?
Well, just following on from what Louisa was saying, I grew up in Canterbury, and in those days, in Christchurch at least, they had a whole library, a whole building devoted to children's books, children's libraries scattered around the city, and my mother was one of the volunteers who worked in that library. So no surprise that a children's writer would be inspired by going every day after school and sitting in a library. And there was things like Tintin books, which I would just sit there for hours and hours and hours reading. But also, just listening to Ian talking about school reminded me of the very first experience of school I had. Walking in, the very first time, and it's probably my only memory of those primary school years. Walked in, the kids are all sitting on the mat, and the teacher was reading Horton Hatch's The Egg. And I think it did have a profound influence on me, just that whole, it was starting school, of course it was going to, but then there was this book which completely captivated me, and that was the start of my school journey really. And the other incident from school that jumps out at me is we had to write a report on what they called a nature trip in those days, which involved, a walk through the bush on Banks Peninsula. And so I thought I'd be a bit cheeky and kind of twist it a bit, and I wrote about how the teacher fell into a bush of stinging nettle and had to take his trousers off. And the teacher, I was shocked, he read out all the assignments, and he came to mine and read it out, and everyone laughed. And it was that shot of audience response, I think, that has also stayed with me a long time when it comes to writing. And so those kind of influences as a child, and the fact that I loved books. And I wasn't so much into writing actually until a lot later, and I think probably about the time, Tom, I was at Teachers College, and Trish Brooking had a children's literature course there. They still do children's literature, although it's not a specific course now, and that was utterly inspiring and got me reading children's books again, and helped me to see that children's literature was an art form. And then I reviewed books for a long time, and I thought I really want to write books. And there was an inner voice, which I'm told is common amongst children's writers, where you imagine a child inside yourself, and that's the child that you're writing for. And an editor said to me once, you do realise that writers get stuck at a particular age they're writing for? And I thought, I'm not going to do that. But actually I do have a particular little 10-year-old boy, I think, inside me, which I who I write for most of the time. So I kind of write stuff that would entertain that inner child. And I think just to race through my writing career, I think the other thing was being a teacher. About the only thing I really loved was reading to kids, reading out loud to kids. And I realised that the power of books, to hold them there and get them to behave, was just amazing.
Wow. And is that power still there, do you think?
In classrooms, yeah, from what I hear.
Good. Wow. Matthew,
Hello.
the floor is yours.
Great.
How are you getting on?
Very good. It's quite a challenge to think about how your artistic career is, and try and compress that in a short space of time. And as I sit and listen to the other art humans here, I realise to some extent I am a kind of imposter on the panel in some ways, because I have a kind of duality about my process, because I'm both interested in art, but I'm also immensely interested in science. And when I was at secondary school, these are formative periods, I did art and art history, and I came across the concept of a Renaissance man, and I found that really appealing. We looked at people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, and these amazing marriage between science and art, and like they're not so separate. Like we put them in different faculties in the university, but maybe the processes are closer than we care to admit maybe sometimes. And so if I look at my life, I feel like that's what I've been about, is trying to find a marriage between these different disciplines. And I think I was super interested in physicality as a kid, but I was also a nerd, and so I liked the intellectual life, but I didn't want to follow that without the expense of my body. Like I wanted to learn and grow without becoming sedentary, and so I think that's part of my journey, and that's what I'm doing with my projects. It's a marriage between the influence of science and studying humans for outcomes scientifically measurable, but also like investigating the experiential, the unknown. I think one of the things you learn as a dancer is, and as a maker, a creative maker, is to sit in the uncomfortable place of unknowing, where you don't know what you're going to produce. It's uncomfortable, it's nerve-wracking, and you're looking for answers, and you become obsessed with that process. So the creative processes that I've made a few works overseas and also in New Zealand, my own choreographies, and they're not so different from writing a thesis, which I recently did for osteopathy. So you get obsessed, you need time to contemplate, you're looking for answers, your brain is functioning in ways that you don't know, and you wake up in the morning with answers. I could put this movement with that movement, or maybe this measure could be used in a physiological study for dancers. And as a dancer, you need to understand your own body. So you need to understand your physics, and you intersect with the health industry. You intersect with osteopaths, and they seem so knowledgeable, or physios, understand the body. You absorb that knowledge because your body is your instrument. So you want to get on top of that. So when I went to university, I studied, firstly I started art history and philosophy, and I'm like, oh no, I'm getting drawn towards arts, but I want to do science and I want to dance, because I just want to do that. So the only place I could do that was phys ed school, and then I'm like, okay, I'll do hard sciences as part of that, because maybe I'll go in that route, and then I left that all to train as a dancer, and now I've come back to it through osteopathy. Yeah, so my projects are kind of weaving those together.
Sounds like an artist, doesn't he? And you don't need to feel bad about that, because as I said, Charles Brash in his statement says that the imagination as expresses itself in the arts and sciences. So it's okay. We're allowed to merge that all together. Thank you all. I'd just like to now move on to the general concept of what your creative process is, how you get your inspiration, or if there is such a thing, or is it all just perspiration, and the sort of the methodology by which you actually create a work. So, creative process, inspiration, and methodology. Who's going to start with that idea?
These aren't simple questions.
These aren't? No. Well, this is not the free lunch doesn't exist.
No.
Well, just generally speaking, I mean, where do you start from? You know, I mean, the creative process, and you get your inspiration from something, or is it different every time you do something? Is there no pattern to your creative process?
I always write what I'm interested in. You know, I hate having to write about something that is popular or will sell or all those kind of things.
Yeah.
So I always start at that point. What am I interested in the moment? Hey, trees have got these fungal networks that are like the internet, and they communicate and they send food and messages underground to trees that are miles away in the forest. Hey, I could write about that because that interests me. And so, you know, I've written a couple of books about that now during this fellowship. And so for me, it's like the ideas are not hard to find. Like science, as you're saying, Matthew, is just chocker, the natural world with fantastic ideas. So that's always my starting point.
And then what's the method then? So if you've had that idea, do you lock yourself away on a daily basis, which you can do, I guess, with the fellowship? Is there a sort of a routine in the way you actually then get to where you want to go?
Writing's easy. It's just putting one word after another, really.
Well, we should all be able to do that, shouldn't we?
That's right. It's not that easy. I think rewriting's the hard bit.
Okay. Yeah.
You've got to rewrite and keep on refining.
Dylan, process, inspiration, methodology.
Inspiration often arises from responding to observations of the sonic world. Well, not always sonic for me, visual things as well, and how I can represent that through a time-based medium of music. And also, the components and the molecules that make up the things that we listen to, and how I can unpick it and reassemble it in different ways, and through like the medium of the instruments that have evolved through time. Like instruments are these expressive tools that have arisen from this certain need that humans have to make sound. So I work a lot with what's afforded to them physically, so that the mechanics that make up what they actually are, and how I can manipulate that, and what the resulting sounds can be from that as well.
Do you, as a composer, what do you use? Do you use a pen and paper? Do you sit at a keyboard, or do you sit at a keyboard? Two kinds of keyboard. One's a musical one, and one's not.
All of that. Well, first of all, it starts in my mind. Then I tend to work on an instrument, so improvising, sort of coaxing different sounds out of that, whether it's a clarinet or a violin, or your voice or electronics. Mm-hmm. And then I will go about notating that with pencil and paper, which gets put into a machine eventually. So.
To make neat and tidy. Yeah. Leanne, do you want to say anything about your process and your inspiration? And
I don't think poets have any pressure from popularity or making money. So,
Oh, do you want to unpack that a wee bit?
as to process, I mean, I keep a notebook, and sometimes things happen outside of that, that I just get something that comes. That doesn't happen very often, all at once. But actually for the Seacliff work, it's been a very different process. I've been looking at the Seacliff Asylum in relation to early Irish migrants, and so the lead into that was really doing an enormous amount of reading, and then refining what I'd done from that largely by a kind of intuition, instinct thing. But the thing about the reading was it's kind of all outside, and I can't write as a poet unless I write from the inside out rather than coming from the outside. So there was I've been down quite a few cul-de-sacs and things, but I've had some really good moments as well, like breaking into a voice poem and breaking into something that's in prose, which was way out of my kind of comfort zone, writing in prose. And when that piece started, actually, I felt like there was this energy field, and I really wanted to keep writing. But I was so mistrustful of the sentence, it was like writing with the brakes on.
Do you get frustrated? You just said there that you end up in a cul-de-sac. Is that artistically frustrating in like a waste of time, or is it going to back up and then end up somewhere else, which you wouldn't have ended up if you hadn't gone down that cul-de-sac in the first place?
Well, I think it's what's already been said, really, in the sense that it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. Yeah, so, and I think, I felt, there was a kind of point where I thought, I'm not sure whether I can do this, like I'm not sure if I can make something happen with this material. So, and you hover a little on that uncertainty for a time, and I just had to keep trusting, actually, and so it was that, and then when something does happen, even if, in a couple of these early pieces I think won't make the cut, but actually they open something up for me. So.
Yeah. Have you had a time to think?
I have, and I can always call on my notes.
Okay, yes, you're allowed to use notes if you wish.
Maybe I'll just follow on from that idea of trust, because I think that's really, it's something I relate to, and I think, it's kind of, there are a lot of ideas around, but it's kind of about trusting that one will go somewhere, and it's kind of about what you do with it, something, I guess. And I guess in my work, this will sound incredibly general, but I'm just interested in how things are already, how I find something, an image, for example, and the format it's in. The format might be as compelling to me for some reason as the picture, or if it's an event, then I guess it's also the context that it happened in. And I think I work with a range of media for the reason that they're all interesting to me, and so I've made a number of film on 16mm. I've organised performances. I've made artist books. Lately, I've been making paper itself and setting copies of archival material, just embedding them back in the material itself. So I guess somehow I draw in a lot of perhaps diverse processes, material processes, but there's a playing out of, I guess, like representation itself. It's kind of driving those things, and increasingly I've become interested in the way that images, if you like, kind of attach themselves to us. How actually we see something and then in a small way it kind of enters our being, we might then carry around that way of seeing something, or it goes on to inform how you see something else. I'm describing something very basic in a way, but I've become really driven by that idea of how do images start to kind of index themselves to biography, and so as a way to work on that, I have images in the studio I'm trying to look at quite deeply, trying to think with as well. Often I use other people's work in my work. I'm interested in those relationships, and I guess sometimes I just desire to maybe put something back in circulation again, and that might just, you could think of an exhibition, I think, as a place to do that, as a venue to put something back out in the world. So, yeah. I don't know if I addressed inspiration, but I think I knocked the other ones off.
Okay. Matthew, do you want to touch on your inspiration or your methodology?
Sure. I'll just start with methodology. I think whatever methods that you employ will determine a lot the outcome, obviously. So in an artistic process, I observed different dance makers applying the same methodology, and that would yield a kind of outcome that was somewhat predictable or formulaic for that artist. And so one of the things that I consider in my process is that the methodology itself is something to be manipulated. And so that in order to guarantee that the outcome may be different from what I could possibly imagine on my own, by myself, or that is different from the things that have gone before, so other things that I've made. So I'm looking, to adapt, to be adaptive with the methodology. And in terms of inspiration, I think I like to draw on the different aspects of performance. So I am not so much interested in observing dancers as machines executing, although I've participated in choreographies like that, but dancers like machines executing a grand design. I'm more interested in feeling the complexity of a person performing, and so there are strategies that you can work with, that I've worked with, that can generate that outcome. So I think of a human being as someone who's engaged in a state of flux where there's uncertainty, where there's decision making, and so in the creative processes I try to create tasks that occupy the dancer so that they're in that state, where as opposed to a dancer who performs and goes, this is it, I know exactly what I'm doing, there's nothing negotiated here, I'm just showing you with my body a form. Whereas I'm interested in the performance where the person, you can feel that they're thinking, that they're alive, there's some uncertainty, they may be making a decision in that moment, so task-based choreography. Yeah, those are some of my inspirations.
Scary for the dancer, I would think that. Sort of improvisation almost.
Yeah, but highly structured,
sure,
because no structure, you can get lost.
Okay.
And I've had experiences where, like in audition processes, where they'll throw out so just show us your best. I'm like, what does best mean? I need some,
please give me
I need some structure.
Sure.
Yeah, I get lost.
Yeah.
You end up dancing like a madman. Yeah.
Move on. So I'm going to ask you all now, who is your work for? Are you creating for yourself, for your public, for your audience? And does this affect your creative process? In other words, the end result, are you thinking about where it's going to end up as you actually create whatever it is you're creating?
I'm happy to start on that.
Yeah.
I was just actually saying before the panel that I've just started to think about my exhibition, which comes up at the end of the Francis Hodgkins Fellowship. It's at the Hocken, and it helped me see that often, for me, a work's finished in an exhibition. It might not really feel finished until then. So I've actually come to really enjoy thinking about that as a space for the work to kind of do something. And so I guess that's what I make work for. And I often see an exhibition as a kind of unit to work with or something. And I think that it's a kind of, it's almost a cliche now to say this, but yeah, I think a work's kind of only half made by me. It's always made, completed by the people who engage with it. And a kind of amazing thing about being an artist is, after a while, an old work, a work from a while ago, it just starts to actually create its own life. Every time it's shown, its story slightly changes, or I get the feeling that works really take on their own journey once they've left my little world.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you always mindful of your audience as you go through your creative process?
Yeah, well, initially it does feel like I'm writing for myself, first and foremost. But the concepts I'm working with sort of rely on a listener for them to have an effect. So I think one of the beauties of music is it can be interpreted in so many different ways. With a lot of my recent work is working with issues of memory. I think we understand music through memory, through repetition, or the opposite of repetition, through a linear process where nothing repeats. If music is open to so many interpretations, but I can guarantee and rely that everybody knows what it feels like to grasp for something, like a memory that's faded, or that's not there, or we've reconstructed differently from the reality of what it was. So with that idea, I am writing for listeners. To have it, in order for it to have an impact, an effect.
Okay, good. It's interesting because I know that we've had one Mozart fellow, I think here many years ago, who was writing because he needed to, and was not the slightest bit concerned if it was ever performed. It was all about his own journey, and if anybody was interested in it, that was a bonus. So he was absolutely writing from a self-centered, thank you, perspective. Yeah, interesting. Rhianne, do you is your process in writing poetry? Are you bearing in mind the fact that you're hoping that it's going to be published and will therefore be enjoyed, or who's your audience? Are you aware of your audience as you're writing?
No.
No, right.
Is the short answer. Not at the very beginning,
sure.
anyway.
Yeah.
No, I'm writing for myself. And actually, it's been interesting this year. Just one of the most productive things I've done is kind of let go attachment to outcome, whether that be in writing one poem, or now as I am starting to think about a manuscript, but just to keep it very fluid and open and spacious has made it possible for other things to happen. And I that wouldn't have been possible without the burns, because the thing about the burns is you've got it's not like writing and having a job where if you sit down for half a day it's your one half day or it's your one day that you've got, and you sit down and nothing happens, and you're not out seeing friends, you're not earning money. You know, it's a different. It's quite, that can be. You know, writers in the audience will know that it can be really tough. That to have a day where you get nothing. You know, I mean, you can see it philosophically and think, okay, well, this is part of it. But so the great thing about the Burns is it loosens everything up.
Yeah. Yeah. If I could just touch on that for a moment. As I understand, the fellowships, all of the fellowships, there's no compulsion, it's not compulsory that you actually, just one moment, we'll just take that call. There's no,
That is the Superman thing. It's gone.
there's no compulsion, I don't think, for any of you to actually create anything during your residency. So if, is that a freedom or an impediment for you as creators? You've got this year or half year to be the fellow, and you're encouraged to just be creative.
I think there's a huge pressure personally, like when you receive this sort of opportunity. It wouldn't matter if I had to make the show or not. You kind of
Obligated.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, you're just excited,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you have time to work in a way you don't usually have, and
Do you mean more about like the pressure you put on yourself?
Yes.
I suppose. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
that's what I mean.
Yeah.
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 Mm.
And hopefully that's a positive pressure.
Mm.
It's not always, but most of the time it is.
Mm.
But actually, I think it would be a problem if I didn't make a show if the gallery was empty at the end.
You wouldn't be invited back. Mm. Yeah. Have I left anybody out? Does anybody want to say anything about? Have I asked you about? No, I haven't asked you, have I? About your about who you're writing for. You've already touched on it.
I have
You're
touched
writing
on
on
it a
this
little
little
bit.
10-year-old boy.
Yeah.
Does that 10-year-old sometimes annoy you?
Sometimes what?
Annoy you?
Annoy me.
Or do they take? Is it all-consuming, or is there not room for some other little person as well to be serviced?
I don't really write for a 10-year-old. I just made that up to entertain you. Actually, really interesting listening to the others talking about this. I mean, of course you're writing for yourself in a way. You know, I want to be immortal. Of course I do. You know, and I love the best moment of all is when that book arrives in the mailbox for the first time that you've had a book published. But then I'm also aware of the audience too, and writers don't get a lot of feedback, contrary to what you might think. But the people that do bother to send you a letter, the child that sends you the letter is the one that says, because of your book, I love honeybees and I'm going to become a beekeeper or whatever. You know. And you think, yes, it has had an effect, and that's a really amazing feeling. Doesn't happen that often, of course.
When you're working on a work, do you all know when it's finished? When do you know when it's time to put down your pen or your, well, whatever it is you're working with? When is a work done? Because I know of people who often tinker and keep tinkering and it's never complete. Is that a discipline that you just have to say, there we are, I'm done. This is as good as it's going to get.
Well, for me, I find I reach a point where I'm exhausted with the material I'm working with.
Right.
So it has a. It's probably more dictated by the length of time that I'm actually working on it rather than the duration of the actual piece. Often it's imposed by external things,
like
concept formats.
Sure.
And,
Yeah.
And what we were talking about before, attention spans as well, seems to have an influence, growing influence.
That's what we were talking about. Can you expand that just a little bit? What do you mean by attention spans as far as a creator is concerned that you've got to be mindful of? Of which you have to be mindful. Sorry.
We were sort of wondering amongst the group of there's a diminishing of the human attention span through our interaction with media now. Was there a conclusion?
Well, no, the conclusion being that in your case, I guess you have got to be finite in the duration of a piece, otherwise people are going to stop listening.
Yeah, well, maybe I'm a bit subversive in a way, but I would like to kick back against something like that and sort of reclaim some space where people can actually listen. So we're so saturated with information and sound. So often I'm working very quietly with small bits of musical information. It's difficult to...
I guess in your case, I'll move on in a moment, but because you're working in, what was the word you used? Sonic. That's a nice word. Sonic arts, which involves other people performing and therefore other audiences listening. Do you have the luxury maybe, which maybe others don't have, of reworking it if needs be? So you can tinker a little bit after you've supposedly finished, after the first performance and so on, can't you?
Yeah, so I often revisit things that I'm not feeling satisfied with. And unfortunately, every space where something is presented offers a new challenge, so I do change things at the last minute. As if you're working in a dry acoustic, things won't necessarily work.
Rianne, you can't do that, can you?
Not when it's published.
Not when it's published. Let's just rework that last word there.
Yeah, so I think just that thing about writing for myself first, that sort of changes as the evolution of the work goes along, which is sort of the evolution to the final thing, so then I've got a couple of people in my life who are first readers or, for work, so who I trust, and so feedback, that kind of feedback is, it helps evolve the work.
So it's part of the process, in fact.
Yeah, and in fact, in that way, I was thinking about that. So much work is indirectly, if not directly, collaborative in a way. I mean, it's not that people who read work and give comments are kind of collaborating, but even sending a work to a publisher, then having someone else read it being sent out to readers, and along the way there are small changes being made, which you can, as author, I can say no, I don't want to do that, but yeah, it is interesting in that, like, to get from the writer, the poet, to a final book is quite a, and then even the book getting out into the world. I mean, that whole thing has a lot of other people.
It's usually collaborative. Yeah.
That's true for me as well. Because if you're creating a piece, you're dealing with humans, and you want them to own what they're performing. So you have to. I find that it's useful to have to let go of the perfectionist mentality in order to just let your piece go out into the world, and like a child, just trust that it's going to get out there and it's going to be okay, and that it will interact with people watching, and it's and also as a respect for the performer, because if you keep tinkering with it, they're always trying to get on top of what it is that you're giving them. And then they'll potentially lose their mastery if they're overloaded with changes or possibilities. So because your instruments are dancers, you've got to be respectful of them in that process. But yeah. But can I just answer another question, which was about do you make work? Do you keep your audience in mind? I had a thought with that regarding the projects that I'm doing. That absolutely, my audience are the people that are undertaking the movement explorations that I think that I've kind of used my whole archive of movement history and study of movement that I think will enhance their well-being. So it's 100% revolving around the people that are coming as a thing. Yeah.
So that process for you as a choreographer, you've created it, but then it's then actually owned by the performers, the dancers, and maybe then the audience, and then it's gone. How does that feel? You know, that it's actually disappeared now. It's and with music too, that it's very much based in time, and then there's nothing left of it. Whereas with a writer and with a visual artist, it actually will live forever.
That's a nice question. I think there is a lineage of dance as in experiences of dancers that become embodied through the interaction of watching a piece. So the piece itself may die, but the memory of it and how it inspired you to move or to change the way that you move. And then if you become a teacher yourself, you can't help but embody all of your influences, and then you pass that on. So there is a life beyond that. But the other side of that is I do feel sad because, especially in New Zealand, the artistic scene is difficult for choreographers. So much work that's generated is here in a flash and gone tomorrow, and you know, some great things that I'm just sad that not more people could see it, or that there's happening in other countries where they have retrospectives, and well, I mean, there's been retrospectives here too, but they revive earlier work, or a piece just has a long life. Like, I mean, if you think about the Pina Bausch Company, some of those pieces, you know, and it's sad that that's not possible in this context.
Yeah. Earlier, we were all talking about fashion, and Raymond just mentioned it before about the popularity of certain sort of subject matters. We were discussing about whether any of your work sort of goes out of date or out of favour or out of style, and whether that's a frustration or that you have the confidence that will come, that it's cyclical and your works will live longer than the fashion or the time.
I wonder how easy that is to judge in a lifetime.
In your own lifetime?
Yeah.
Well, it's a retrospective, isn't it, I guess? Yeah.
I did have a casual conversation with a friend recently that work looked okay again after about 5 years, but I don't know. might need to be longer than that.
I think it would need to be a little bit longer than that. Yeah. I mean, in children's literature, it's changing all the while, isn't it? And does that mean that something that you wrote 5 or 6 years ago is now no longer popular, or good anymore?
Certainly out of print.
I mean, I wonder how much this is really an artist's concern, to be honest, because I think that what compels you to make is the present, and it can be useful to go back to old work, and to, obviously there's always a thread that's flowing through, but I don't know, I feel that if you started to think about that or worry about how your work would be when it went out of fashion, for example, that would just be the worst space to get into. So, yeah, I kind of think I try not to think about that.
But then on the other hand, there could be a time when you look back at your own stuff and say, I wish I didn't put that out then, because my journey has become so much better now than it was then. And I mean, I know of composers who will destroy earlier works because they don't want people to hear it anymore, because they've moved to a different place, and what they were doing earlier they now no longer wish to share with anybody.
Are they all men?
What am I meant to say to that? I don't know. Probably.
It does seem unconstructive.
Yeah.
I think it's like living a life with regret. You know, like the decisions that you make, whether they're artistic decisions or life decisions, you have to remember your thought processes at the time that led you to those conclusions, and it's the same with the for me, it's the same with looking at my earlier work. I'm like, well, I wouldn't make that now, but I understand the zeitgeist that was made in and how it reflects that. And it may or may not be relevant now, or it may take more time for it to become re-relevant, you know. So,
and I think also it might, perhaps the worry is that it seems less resolved, but that's often most interesting for an audience, you know. So I think you have to let go of that.
Yeah, and I feel like an artwork is precious, so it's, you know, like even though the person who made it no longer has an appreciation for it, it's kind of sad to censor that, you know, like if, in the case of this composer, you know, to take it away.
And also, I guess if you're thinking of the Library of Dance, like if you go back, or you know, or you can see things, there's things that you can find useful. These might be out of date, but there's things that you know. So I think that's definitely true for writing, where writers supposedly go out of date, but people go back and read them and always finding some other approach or something else. You know, and this is, I mean, in that history, a lot of women writers who were never in date, you know, have only had their moment after their deaths. You know? So
imagine if they spent their whole life thinking, oh, I've got to get rid of that.
Yeah.
You know, no one cares about
exactly.
it.
I mean,
It would be a disaster.
Yeah.
And there is a sort of an asynchronous thing at play in history and time and style and stuff. You know, things rub up against each other in ways you don't, you know, that you can't know or predict or, you know.
Yeah, and this is what the Academy does well.
Mm.
You know, Fossick's around, finds things.
Yeah, so I guess that it shows that you've got that you as artists are working now, and it's just part of the fabric that you can't be too precious about whether it's going to be liked today or not tomorrow. You just do it and see what happens. Maybe. I'm going to open to the floor, I think, now. And Linda has got a microphone, which she is going to wander around. If anybody would like to ask any of the fellows a question, there's a hand there already.
Oh, I think there's a gap down in the middle.
Yes, there's a centre aisle.
So this is the first person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to pick up on where the discussion kind of finished there in talking about censorship of work gone by. How do you respond to the kind of movement that is around some of the attitudes, perhaps around gender or race, whereby works that have gone before which might reflect attitudes that are kind of objectionable or even abhorrent now, are so out of fashion that they're censored out of existence, or we are no longer allowed to engage with them, and we can't actually reflect on the time and the place in which they were created?
Well, when I think back to the Tintin books I read as a child, the main character was a middle-aged alcoholic. People got shot. It was totally it would never get published now.
No.
But in those books, in the early ones especially, the racial stereotypes were shocking. And those books, like Tintin in the Congo, for example, just were out of print for a long, long time. But then thankfully they were reprinted recently in the last decade or so. But with a note in the front saying, this reflects the colonialist attitudes of Belgium or whatever it was, I think, in those days. And I think that's, to censor them is crazy, or to censor Little House on the Prairie because of some attitudes like that. I think, you need to let children know, well, this is what it was like back then. Yeah, this is why this is horrendous stereotype in this book.
Yes, thank you. Because did I not hear recently that a statue in some central... Yes, I know. It was Stephen Foster, the American composer, folk composer, the statue of him in his hometown, he's been dead for 100 years, has been removed because his inspiration was the music of the African American, and there's the statue is of him standing there in the centre of town, and sitting down at his feet is a Negro playing a banjo. It's been removed because it's what?
Offensive
Offensive
to some people.
to some people. Yeah.
Well, Burns himself got caught up in that, didn't he? I mean,
Tell us.
retelling of his reputation with. Well, there was something about the Me Too campaign and reassessing. I don't know enough about Burns' biography to comment on it really, but something about how it, just how he was with women and
He's one of us
whether
best.
we should hold him in such high regard. So.
It's often better not to know too much about creative people's private
Well, we've
lives.
been.
Well, it does affect things, doesn't it?
Well, I don't, but like, is the work separate from the person? I think that's really what's at stake.
Well, a lot of
And
writers
is,
are
and,
really.
is a novel separate from its context?
Yeah.
And I think, those things need to be acknowledged. They shouldn't be banned, but they need to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah, acknowledged, not banned. Thank you. Another question from the floor. Here's one down the front.
I think I'm brave enough to ask it. What impresses me is that you're expressing yourself, you're opening yourselves up so much to people by the expression of your art. How do you cope with criticism?
They don't get any. Ever. Do you take your book critics happily?
Actually,
Do you ignore them?
I find most book reviews of my books that I've had have been not so critical, as in they're not analysing enough. And the best one I had was the only one that was really picked apart my first novel, and it was by a 13-year-old. And I thought, this is great. This is what I really want to hear, and from the audience I really wanted to hear it from too. And it was my first novel, and it did have things that were, I'm sort of looking back, I think, yes, I really should have improved that. So yeah, really good criticism is just fantastic. Too late.
Yeah, well, that was my question earlier, wasn't it? Do you look back at some of your work and think, ooh, I should have done that differently?
Oh yeah, but that's inevitable.
That's inevitable, yeah.
I think that's an important point, is that it's an art in itself,
Yeah.
the art of critique. So some people are able to deliver that critique in a critique sandwich, positive, negative, positive,
Yeah.
and then it's palatable to the human. Yeah. And others are not. And I feel often in the case of dance that the level of discourse in the reviews, which could be really constructively critical, it doesn't often get to that point. It sits more at the level of opinion, and I don't think I could tell a bad joke here actually. One of my choreographers that I worked for, he said that opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one. So I mean, that's not so important. It is the criticality and the degree of argument, and then it can be like Raymond was saying, then it can be something that can be really useful.
In some reviews, you just don't get them at all. Like I had one review for Shift, which had, it follows it's a relationship between two women for a good part of it, and it was a guy reviewing it, and he said, he basically said, I don't understand anything about relationship woman to woman, so that whole bit, he couldn't get, it was shunted off. So it was like, yes. It's a different kind of love or something. It's not, it's just, yeah.
It's still human, nonetheless.
Yes.
Yeah, well, exactly. So it was just when people come out with.
So Dylan, do you have works of yours which are performed and reviewed, which then hurt or impact then on how you might do something next time? Or you just ignore it all?
I think what you're saying about dance reviews, with music, it tends to be an account of what happened, rather than sort of opinions. So it can be quite hard to get any kind of critique, positive or negative, from that actually. So.
Oh well, that's just that's another whole
But
thing.
I mean, peer criticism is another thing, which can be very influential. I find, especially people you work so closely with, if they have enough courage to mention something to you.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's different for a straight performer, because a lot of them will actually not read critiques because it doesn't.
It can be overwhelming.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm taking the closest ones to the
Okay.
microphone.
Nothing personal.
Kia ora. I'm really fascinated about the languages that are across the arts, and in reality, my view is that you cannot control your audience. I'm interested how it's sort of turned into this, because people just may be of different cultures, but it will take its own life once it leaves you to whoever interprets it, be it in time and place, because it's a moment of your time. What I'm really interested in is, you talked about, there was the question about inspiration, but I'm interested in what any of you aspire to actually leave traces of yourself for the future, and who those audiences might be.
It's sort of like your poetic DNA or something.
I am a bit of a messagey writer, and whenever I send something off to a publisher, they sometimes comes back with too messagey written all over. Get rid of the message. Yeah, but that's kind of like a lot of what my writing is all about, admittedly. It's like I'm writing about trees now, and I'd really like to think that people will fall in love with trees and want to plant trees and see that trees are going to save the planet. Kind of, it gets into an idea like that gets into my head and takes hold, and I just can't stop it really. And you kind of convince yourself that this is the thing, the salvation of the planet rests on trees. Suddenly, a couple of years ago it was bees. At least they rhyme.
And that is your sense of, you mentioned the word before, your immortality, that is what you're going to leave behind, isn't it? Trees and bees. And so, yeah.
I aspire to, I hope that the joy and pleasure of movement is something that I, not necessarily like my legacy, but a legacy that I can encourage. And to go, I would like to go beyond the artistic realm and encourage all humans to move more and to dance more. So that's what I'd like to do, even if it's like a tiny, minuscule nudge in that direction.
If you were writing in a really repressive regime, or composing, how would that change? I'm thinking of the fact that in East Germany and so on, the arts had a huge impact because they were the only way in which people could express themselves. Have you thought about what it would be like to write in a really repressive regime where it could be dangerous to say what you said?
Go on.
I think that would probably be difficult to assess until you were in the circumstance. Like, how do you know how, as a character, you would be able to behave, be, let alone create, if you were really suffering, I think it would be. So yeah, I think it's quite hard to put yourself in that circumstance and to see the courage and the bravery of writers who have continued to write under that. It's just, yeah, it's a throws quite a bit into relief. That.
Yeah, so I think about Shostakovich and the fact that Stalin was breathing down his neck through his life. And he was really controlled with what his output could be. But the sort of ingenious ways he found to put codes into the music and sort of found a personal language despite the repression.
He was brave. He was brave, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to imagine.
Yeah, I mean, all that comes to mind for me is I briefly studied 20th century Polish art history, and which had an official art program, which was of less interest to me. But what I did find really inspiring was the way that people found communities and networks around that, and some quite elegant and great works were made just in people's houses or circulated as on paper or some highly imaginative really incredible work could happen, and I think it's quite of course no one wants to live under such a regime as you are suggesting, but I think it's the flip side is that I guess people will somehow always will continue to make work and share work, and this actually what I enjoyed taking from that history was the social value that art could have. So it wasn't an economic unit at all, and it wasn't even a public one, but it had this really high value to the people who were producing and sharing it. So, yeah.
I was sorry, I have a response to that too. I remember being in a festival where they were remarking that the interesting work currently in dance is coming from China, but it's a high degree of censorship, and that was an interesting point because it comes back to that audition experience I had where they just asked me to improvise in such an open way, and I found that difficult. And that can also happen in the artistic process where, because there are such strong limitations, that can actually, limitations are really useful, like in terms of defining your artistic process. So it's this strange blessing in disguise. But of course, what a price to pay for that, potentially making your artwork more interesting to a wider audience because of those restrictions that you have to maneuver in, but then you have to experience that regime. So, yeah.
You had a question?
Thank you. I just want to ask someone why you chose to come to our amazing Otago University.
For money, wasn't it?
There aren't that many programs in New Zealand which can afford you at the time. But it's about time and the privilege of having space to reflect on what you want to do. Before now I didn't really know Dunedin, and so I've come to really love what it can offer, and the space, the geography, and the weather is actually better than I thought it would be as well. It's a pleasure to me.
I think that all the fellows here are here because of the University of Otago. It's the only one in the country that has got so many and coordinated so well.
But I'm pleased you've come and we're all able to come along.
There we go. Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? Here's one down here, Linda.
Just continuing the theme of the question before, is 2018 a good time for you to be here? I mean, I know you're here now, and you won't know, but if we were here a few years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, do you feel that we're in a better space now than for you doing what you're doing than what it would have been a few years previous?
I'm concerned that, I'm having kind of words here, that actually we're entering a more conservative era, so politically, so I don't, globally, so I don't quite know how to answer that question, because it's a bit hard to put yourself back in time, but maybe I'm pleased to be doing it now rather than in 2028. But I hope I don't live to agree with that as well.
For me, it's a very melancholy experience coming at this particular time because as I said, I started in FZ, and that's where dance has been housed, and the Caroline Plummer has been housed, and it's also where I started dancing. The studios in there, Shona Dunlop McTavish, she ran classes there, and that's where I took them. And this is the last year that studio will exist, and so it's like a homecoming, and it's where I started, and I want to come back and give to the community, so the timing in that sense is good, but I'm super sad about the state of dance, that it's not considered important enough anymore, that it's like losing its place a bit. Yeah.
Mm. Are you going to say something? No? Got one more question over here. It's the whole... It's sad that you're melancholy, but I understand what you're saying, because the whole humanities division is in a state of...
Yeah, I was just...
undervalue. Speak. Sorry,
I was just curious
yours.
about those sort of the University of Otago's expectations regarding the fellowships, which you talked about at the beginning, and just about sort of the university relying on the fellows to challenge people and entertain us and tell us who we are. And I guess I was thinking those seem quite big expectations for 1 year. and I just wondered generally, as artists, do you feel well supported in New Zealand, not only in this year, because this is obviously a lucky year, but do you feel well supported to do your craft? And I mean supported financially and morally by us as a people overall? Or do you sometimes feel like chucking it all in and saying, stuff yous all, find yourselves? Yeah.
That's a lovely final question.
Yeah. I've always felt, I haven't lived in Dunedin all my life, but I've been a writer in Dunedin all my life, and always felt really well supported in Dunedin as a writer, just whenever there's events and things, and that's been really great, because and you could be gloomy about the publishing scene in New Zealand. All the big publishers have gone offshore, and left behind one giant one in Auckland, which it takes about 4 novels a year, I think, and and then there's children's publishing, which is even more difficult, I think. But as far as local support goes, that's for me really the important thing.
I think you can have community support, like from friends who are writers, and you have that kind of support. But earning a living as a poet has got no easier. So.
Yeah, I mean, I had to go abroad to make a living as a dancer, really, like to really live in a decent way. So that was I mean, it was good on some levels for getting a huge wealth of experience, but that's also the reality. So, and I've hybridized myself, which is like so that I can earn a living. And we were talking about this and there was I think there was kind of a jealousy on running both ways, because I see the virtue of focusing solely on your endeavours, but then you have to reconcile that with the reality of the situation you're in, support your family, support yourself, so you can hybridise like I have, but that does mean that you sacrifice your ability to focus solely on one thing, and it is hard to be a Renaissance human in this time, in this day and age.
I think there's a lot of growing competition as well over funding, which is actually quite a struggle, I think. So you're fighting amongst your colleagues to make projects happen, and I think music organisations actually underestimate New Zealanders. New Zealanders aren't afraid of having New Zealand content, but the organisations aren't really giving enough exposure to New Zealand music, I think.
And I guess I would say that I think this is I'm very thankful for I feel I'm in a room where there's a lot of support for what we do and what I do. But I would also love to see that feeling spread a little widely, a bit more widely in New Zealand as a society. I think we could do a lot more to value the arts, and I think that just starts with probably every single one of us, just getting along to something and encouraging someone else to, and participating in the programs that are going on.
Thank you. I think being a Renaissance person has always been a challenge, even from the Renaissance onwards. So nothing new, I think, about the challenges that we face. We do have a government which has trying to turn the tide of 9 years of non-Renaissance as far as our sector of the world is concerned, which is to be celebrated. And one can feel gloomy about the demise of performance spaces and our theatre company in the city, but that's cyclical as well, I guess. So we live in a lovely little place at the bottom of the world, and we've got a lot to celebrate. Anyway, I'm not lecturing here. I just want to say thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Professor Tony Ballantyne from the university, Linda Cullen and Johnny Chapman at the DPAG, you all for coming, and for the fellows for giving us their time and a little bit of insight today into how it all works. And I'd like you all to join us now for afternoon tea. But before you go, I've got a wee plug for myself, if I may. Arts Festival Dunedin launched its program for this year last week. I've got a whole lot of brochures here. Some of you may already have those. Festival's on from the 21st to the 30th of September this year. Use it or lose it. Thank you all very much.